Alright, hey everyone. Today we are going to talk about Marvel Rivals. And you can see that Magneto is on the screen because we're going to talk specifically about Magneto and more so also about the tank class in Marvel Rivals. I've touched on this previously. This video is going to be remade in the future at some point. But as of right now, it doesn't exist. So this is going to be going to have to be what we have until it is remade with higher production in the future whenever I get the resources to be able to do it. Also, I don't know, maybe I won't remake it, but if I kind of want to do it right, you know? So it's probably gonna end up existing. Anyway, not to drag on too much, we are going to talk about why it is that the tank class in Marvel Rivals sucks. And more so specifically about how we can make Magneto a bit better. How we can make him a lot more fun to play and feel a lot better. And just how we can encourage people to want to pick tanks. Because currently that's not happening. And that hasn't really ever been happening. And the reason why that's the case is because not that they are shit or that the class is bad, but they are extremely boring and really unfun to play in spite of their strength. And that's a huge problem. That's like telling a kid, or rather not telling a kid, that analogy is never going to work with the next thing I'm going to say. Cage fight. So, yeah, it's perfect. That's why we didn't talk about kids, right? So if we were to talk about a fight or a cage fight or whatever, just a fight in general, and you had to choose a weapon, right? And your opponent, I don't know, you could choose whatever you want, but your opponent gets to have, I don't know, let's say like a big cannon. Oh, that's kind of fun. That's a bad one. Let's say that the opponent is encased in a suit of very, very, very heavy armor so that he basically cannot get hurt. Yeah, that works. And then as a downside, his fists are only wearing mittens, like oven mittens. That's basically what the tank class in Marvel Rivals is. And we don't want that if we are to have a fun class of heroes that is going to be popular, fun to play, just in general be healthy for the game. Because it is truly a pretty big issue that Marvel Rivals haven't actually gotten control of the tank and also to some degree support situation, because that is inevitably going to hurt the game in some way, and it might be in a very detrimental way actually. Additionally, there are some other things like the engine and the the foundation of every system in the game is kind of not where it ideally should be. And the reason that it's not is because the bar is very, very high, and the reason the bar is high is because we sort of always come back to comparing hero shooters to Overwatch, because they took what made Team Fortress 2 really good, and then they made the best version that has existed yet. Now, Overwatch has its problems, but the feel of that game, and just in general, everything cosmetic, everything meant to pique your interest, just in sort of hidden ways and stuff like that, is just so peak. It is so well made. It's so high quality. No matter how trash Blizzard is, Overwatch is just extremely well made from a technical standpoint. It's really good. And therefore, it's kind of impossible to make a hero shooter ever that is going to beat Overwatch, because you always come back to having to actually beat what Overwatch is good at. Marvel Rivals, in the long run, I strongly doubt they're going to do it. Right now, they have probably taken... I'd probably guess that they have the majority of the cake right now. But I don't think they can hold on to it. And if they do manage, or rather if Overwatch does not pull back at some point, then I believe it's because the genre itself is going to die. I don't think that's really going to happen in reality. I think it's a really fun genre that is kind of universal and timeless, but who knows? We'll see, right? Without further ado, let's talk about specifically Magneto and how to improve him. Because if we start off with Magneto's problems, as with every tank in the game, wait, okay, you know what? I'll just get these up first. There we go. As with every tank in the game, his abilities feel bad to use. And in large part, that's often because the tanks don't deal any damage. They don't deal any damage at all. It is it's actually kind of mind-blowing how little damage that they are allowed to do. And the design, the reason behind this design decision is that it's kind of takes the MOBA version of what a tank is and tries to fit it into the hero shooter. So that would be something we're going to compare it to League of Legends. So that would be something like Sion, Malphite, Maokai, right? These champions that they can deal a lot of damage if they are ahead, but because Marvel Rivals and just hero shooters in general, for the most part, work the way they do, tanks just can't reach a point where they are ahead of the curve and therefore deal a lot of damage and become what League of Legends tanks can become. And that's important because that's really the appeal of tanks. It is not that you deal massive damage, but it is that if you are ahead, there is literally nothing that can stop you. And because nothing can stop you, you will endlessly wither down your opponent and march upon them until their deaths, because they just cannot break through you. In Marvel Rivals, the tanks are never going to reach that point. You are never going to be the main DPS threat or whatever. It's never going to reach that level of fun. What you do is that you're still very important in many situations. You make up like engage or disengage or protecting your teammates or engaging or whatever. But you don't really have much agency to do anything yourself, really. And that's a big problem. For Magneto specifically, his barrier feels pretty weak. It feels weak and kind of bad to use. His bubbles feel pretty bad and the shared cooldown sucks. His right click is weak and the Iron Ring passive is unsatisfying. What are Magneto's, or rather, what is his identity then? And is it shown through his abilities? So it's about magnetism and ferromancy. Those are like his two, or like the big parts of who Magneto is in terms of his power, right? Because the characters themselves, for the most part, I'd imagine they've gotten them correct. Magneto is not typically this buff, but that doesn't really matter. I don't know endless amounts of lore about the Marvel Universe and comics and all that, so I'll leave that to someone else right now. I generally tend to like most of the stuff. I think it's it's kind of cute, you know. It has the OG comic flair for the most part. Like, does this specifically look like someone who is what you'd call a mutant, as well as being someone who can warp metal and control magnetism and stuff like that? Does this look like that? No, well, I mean, kind of, but not really, you know. It just looks like a knight. And does his helmet look like what it is supposed to do, like why he actually wears it? No, there's no signifier. But it doesn't really matter because it's just kind of wholesome, you know. It's the classic kind of wrestler vibe, right? And it's made in an appealing, very simple way so that most people don't have to think too much. And that's not an insult to people. That's completely fine. You've probably seen around the web that a lot of people praise the character design in Marvel Rivals, which to some might be baffling. I know whenever I read those opinions, I tend to be like, what the fuck is wrong with you, right? Why do you need so little complexity to function? And why, as soon as there is complexity, do you fall apart? Because some of these people tend to be very toxic. Not everyone, some of them. Generally, it reaches for the lowest common denominator. And that's because you don't really want to think. You just want to have fun, right? It depends on what your goal is, but most people's goals aren't to think deeply about this stuff. You can, obviously, as many releases in many games have shown throughout the years, you can reach both at once. You can be relatively simple and still appealing, or very complex and still appealing, and every combination between those points. But truth is just that if you want to be faithful to what the superheroes look like and sort of who they are, you don't deviate too much. That's fine. In terms of his identity, magnetism, ferromancy, what does he really do? He does have a spell that pushes someone away, so there's some, you could argue that's magnetism in some ways. I suppose his barrier and his bubbles, you could argue that, well, it's at least made in a way that it's supposed to be that he uses like iron sheets and he pulls up metal to actually shield people. Then we have his ultimate, which absorbs bullets and other projectiles. That's magnetism. But in general, it's like, well, you don't really get the feeling of his actual power source, I don't think. It's not very well executed. Like his passive, even like the thing of pushing people away with, sorry, not his passive, but his right click, right? It doesn't really feel that good. It's also not, and it's supposed to feel good. It's supposed to feel great. It's like, it's a very good way of making an appealing spell, but they just didn't reach the point where it was appealing. Just never became appealing. It pushes people away, but he does it by throwing stuff at people and not by his power source, which is a little bit baffling. And then we also have his melee attack, which is the blade, right? He pulls out the blade. And you gotta wonder a little bit, like, okay, why isn't that part of another spell? And then you might say, well, they team up with Scarlet Witch. But that is not comparable. So my goals for Magneto is to try and change that. To use what he already has, not change who he already is too much, but give him some new tools, change some of his current tools to fit the idea of what he's supposed to be. What would make him fun to play? Use the ideas that are already present and then actually refine them, right? In doing this, we are going to be touching pretty much every part of him. we're going to be removing one of the shields and one of the, I suppose it's, what do you call that? The bubbles, right? The bubbles. And then we'll be changing the mag cannon, which is the right click, right? That you could easily make that a cool spell, but I think there's something cooler to do with it. And then most of the other stuff will actually be changing around a little bit. And then giving him a new right click instead of mag cannon. Right, this was some exploration about what he can currently do. And then I made a few tweaks because I wanted to get some ideas down. And then I got his silhouette down and just kind of what it would look like, right? Just to get an idea about things. And so these are the elements that we are going to be working around. The things that you see on the screen right here. Right, so to start off, now I'm going to drop a bunch of information and I'm gonna try to make it as attractive as possible. But obviously there's a lot right here, right? And this is basically his new kit that I gave him. So his passive is going to remain being the iron ring, right? This is the ring behind Magneto's head. You can see it marked with a 1 here. When Magneto blocks incoming damage with his abilities, he charges himself up to a maximum of 100%. It's slowly lost over time when he hasn't charged it up for a short while. So this is the Zarya mechanic from Overwatch. And the reason I think that's relevant for Magneto is because whenever you have a character that kind of works with multiple, or rather a tank that works with multiple defensive barriers and spells to help teammates, they themselves tend to be really boring. And to counteract that, you want to give them damage. So by converting damage blocking into damage, just like Zarya does, you gain a very, very, very fun to play character because you are rewarded by doing your job, right? And you get to have fun by stomping people because you're doing a good job. So I think that's really the only way you can do a character like Magneto, where he has so much emphasis on trying to protect teammates and just generally blocking damage. The only way is basically to do this charge up thing. And he kind of tries to have it right now by giving his mag cannon like faster charge up, but it just doesn't work. It is very, very, very poorly executed in my opinion. Right, onto his left click. So his primary fire. This is a positive negative force thing, where every other attack switches between firing a bolt just as he does right now, but after a short delay it would either explode or implode, dealing extra damage and pushing people in, or rather pushing people away from the center or pulling them towards the center, right? And he switches between them, right? And the thing that's cool about this is that it interacts with the rest of the kit in some ways. But the reason I really wanted this is because it supports the idea of magnetism by a lot, right? He now gets to switch between those two elements of his power source, which wasn't really present thus far. He hadn't really had it in his kit, right? So I think it's a really cool idea to show it off, and it also synergizes with his kit, so that you can play in unique ways when it comes to whether or not you want to push people away or pull them in and all that stuff, and where you shoot and how you shoot people, right? For his right click, this is the payoff. Magneto creates the sword just as he does in his melee, but he charges for a little while, creating the sword, and then he swings it, dealing massive damage. This is the payoff for controlling the opponent's position. So this is Magneto's own payoff, right? Obviously, he can make cool plays where he manipulates position of enemies in game or in general. But if he needs to have some payoff himself, I think it's a good idea to give the ranged character a melee attack, because he's not usually incentivized to go melee, but now he is, and his abilities allow him to be able to actually go melee. Onto his shift. Magneto creates a small barrier in front of himself for a duration by holding shift. Holding primary fire will send the barrier forward, locking its direction whenever released, and its new position too, right? So this is basically a barrier that you can carry around, but you can also use it like Sigma does in Overwatch. I think this is the best way to create the type of spell that he has, just because, first of all, we get the idea that he can control metal because he pushes the barrier away. It has to do with magnetism, once again, because he manipulates the position of it. And then also, this is the other thing. I have written here that holding secondary fire while the barrier is active will pull people in front of it inwards. I have since changed that because there's no real reason to have that. So instead, it just passively pulls people towards its front. And then it has some benefits based on Iron Ring percentage or whatever. And the idea behind having the barrier pull people towards it is that you once again get the ability to pay off with Magno Blade, right? And manipulate people's positions. Then we have Magno Shield, and this is a simplified version of the bubbles that he already does have. And that's just that he holds down his button on an ally and they gain a barrier. Now, there is one negative thing about this spell. At some point, I used to have it in a way that you could use it in two different ways, so that if you were by yourself, it wouldn't be a problem. But now, you can't use it on yourself. And that's a little bit of an issue because it limits agency. That being said, I have ended up combining it with its with the Metallic Curtain's resources. I think I might have called it Iron Curtain earlier. That's, of course, something else. Don't get me wrong. But I shared some resources behind how you use the spell and how you use the barrier. So basically, it's not that important that you can't use it effectively on yourself. For the ultimates, basically the exact same thing. I changed very, very tiny things, but we'll get to that when we get to its page. I haven't written it here exactly, but it's nothing major. Right, so Iron Ring. When Magneto blocks damage with his abilities, he charges himself up. Okay, cool. Magneto loses 5% charge after not gaining charge for 2 seconds. He'll gain 1% charge for every 10 damage he blocks with his defensive spells, right? So the barrier, the bubbles, and the ultimate. As you can see, I have it's a different name here. It says guard or grind, and that's because that's the old spell, basically, that I created for him, which was either a bubble to shield an ally or the blade. I've changed that since, but basically his defensive spells are the ones that create charge. Iron Ring increases all damage output by its own charge percentage. Cool. Primary fire. Positive, negative force. He fires bolts that implode or explode on impact. And then we have all of the stats for how it works. The idea here is that it strengthens generally with charge, right? So that it feels good. Whenever you're at like 90% and above, you feel like a god amongst men, right? You get to have your power moment. He's not as powerful when he's very low on charge. When he's in the middle, he's pretty typical, and he's probably fit somewhere around the like his percentage in terms of how strong he feels compared to the rest of the roster, right? So if he's below 50, he's probably a little bit weaker, hopefully. That's the idea at least. And if he's above, he's probably a little bit stronger. Right. So it has to do, or rather the changes I made had to do with the fire rate. I slowed it down a little bit and made it quicker if he's charged up. I made the projectiles a little bit slower because they are going to be a lot heavier and have a lot more oomph to them and strength and power in general. As you can also see, I've changed the damage around a little bit. And the reason I've done this is because I added the explosion and implosion damage, and I added the percentage damage charge upgrade thing. And that basically means that this spell can end, or rather, his attacks can end up at 100%, dealing, what is this? 15, 30, that's 60, right? So it's going to be 100. So it's going to deal 100 damage per attack if he hits every part of it. And that's a lot. So that's also why generally he is made to be a little bit weaker by default in some ways. Then we have secondary fire, which is the blade. Now he channels for a duration and then he deals a lot of damage based on ironing percentage, part of it, and it has a pretty short range. It also depletes all your charge. So this is a payoff that you kind of have to figure out whether you want to use or not and how to time it as well. You can punish people very, very hard, but if you do not manage to use it correctly, you can also get punished very, very hard. There is a question about if it deals too little damage actually, because it is borderline supposed to be a very, very, very strong spell. And there normally probably isn't many situations where you could use it, but this, like, you'd have to playtest to even understand how to balance it. So I can't really give much more than what I have here. Then we have the Metal Bulwark. He can hold E to engulf his targeted ally in a protective bubble. It disables all other abilities and attacks in the meantime, and releasing it will stop the barrier. Cool. And here you can see that it has an uptime cost, it has an uptime resource, maximum resource, and it has a regeneration and a cooldown. And that is shared with his barrier. You can also see that its cost is reduced by a certain amount depending on how much charge up you have. And one of my problems was that I often, since I gave pretty much every spell a scaling with iron percentage, in the end he would end up becoming, or rather I don't know if he would, right? I couldn't playtest, but the idea is that he'd be exponentially more powerful, and it'd be exponentially easier for him to upkeep his percentage charge. So hopefully he is somewhere around being balanced. I think he's maybe a little too powerful. But hopefully he's somewhere around that when he has relatively high percentage, because that's kind of the idea behind this stuff, right? That it's difficult to get there, but once you get there, it's pretty easy to keep that up. And I don't know if that's a healthy gameplay loop. Anyway, Metallic Curtain. Magneto creates a barrier that pulls in enemies. He can push it forward and all that jazz we talked about. Cool. And it has a lower cost. It also has the reduction, and then the barrier grows based on percentage, and it also pulls in an area based on percentage and at a speed based on percentage. Not much more to say about that. Generally, it is also supposed to feel powerful to use and be kind of intricate, and you can be creative with it. Ultimate. Exact same thing, damage scales off of Iron Ring percentage instead of absorption, and I have also written that it consumes all Iron Ring charge, and that's pretty much just to nerf him a little bit because he's quite powerful, right? And this spell is definitely going to be over the top with the new way that it would work. Also, I've written in parentheses that he should have a lower movement speed, and his movement speed already isn't very high. The idea is basically that he's slow, not necessarily that it is lower, because it kind of already is. So just that he is a slow dude, right? Because he's a tank. Passively, what do we need to do about Magneto to make him feel good to play if we were to change nothing about his kit? First of all, we need increased weight and better physics, right? We need the feeling of the game and the universe and just the engine and everything in between to feel really, really good and give us the feeling that we crave when imagining ourselves a tank amongst superheroes, and also Magneto himself, right? He needs to have animations that are heavy, slow, need charge, and have a cosmetic oomph. We need to, what that means specifically, stuff like we need to see a clenching fist that is really trying to clench its hand like it's a difficult task to do. We need to see in the characters and their abilities they perform and what they do, that whatever they do is truly really, really powerful. As an example, which I have written just above the point I just mentioned, having his primary fire that swaps between the two magnetic forces, whenever he fires one of those, he would sort of mimic whether it explodes or implodes. So he would throw out the bolt, right? And then it lands, and when it lands, he'd go, okay, I'm the one controlling the bolt. I control it to either expand or that you can't say implant. But either expand or implode, right? I can't remember the word I was gonna say, but implode. And he could do that by either stretching his fingers out if he wants to expand, or closing his fist, just like kind of like Darth Vader whenever he wants to choke people, right? He then do that whenever he wants the bolt that he fired to implode. That would be thematically pleasing, and it would feel really good to just pilot in general, which is very important. Then there's the point of screen shakes and following the motion of action. This is quite hard to do when it's third person, and a lot of the issues I actually think come from the fact that it's the third person. But then again, I don't think it's impossible to implement, even if it might be very difficult. Whether it's worth it is a question within itself, right? But let's take a look here. What would that be like? So we all know Reinhardt, right? Overwatch, Reinhardt. He is one of the characters that is the best examples of what we want the feeling of tanks to be. When we jump as Reinhardt, we feel like the tank. When we walk as Reinhardt, we feel like the tank. The sound that it makes, the motion that the camera follows, in general our own walk animation and what it does to the feeling of the character and controlling them. Whenever we hit people with the hammer, there's displacement in his attacks, right? And it feels heavy, it feels strong, it feels good to land. And not all tanks have displacements or very big heavy attacks. But having slow attacks that are heavy and having some kind of like really powerful effect whenever they do land, because they are kind of conditional, is very important. In our case, for Magneto, if let's say that he was a first-person character, right? Using the blade. Using the blade is the perfect example of how you can sort of make it like akin to Reinhardt's normal attack, right? But have it be a big charge up. And that the camera would then follow the motion of the swing as well of the hammer, or in this case the blade. Stronger sounds and distinct visual effects based on magnetism and ferromancy. This is just a straight up upgrade that I think is relevant to mention because it would just better the experience. Hitting people should sound more gruesome. Up to interpretation, because this is probably not possible if we are talking about stuff like breaking bones, but they should just feel powerful. That's really the main point. Cosmetic gameplay features like slight displacements. Cool. So once again, this is just stuff that doesn't really end up doing anything, but it feels good. It feels powerful to land. A good example is just having this passively on every tank's attack, like their normal auto attack. Or rather, it's called primary fire in this type of game, right? Just have it displace slightly. Loud and rumbling magnetic aura in nearby presence, scaling with charge. So this is a thematic cosmetic thing where I generally believe that a thing that the tank should have, if we are to make them truly fun, in my opinion, is this kind of feeling that they are raid bosses, right? So you know where they are at all points, and their aura and their general vicinity just feels scary and powerful because they are present. They command attention. They are the center of the battle. They are the ones that decide that this is where the battle does take place, and here is why it takes place, right? And I think that's actually really important. This is not something that Overwatch necessarily does, but it's at least more of the way than Marvel Rivals is, right? Another example is terrain pieces floating lightly around Magneto with metallic energy. And it's just in general to, like, you go near Magneto, and even if he's behind a wall that's pretty thin maybe, you'd be able to sense that, oh god, stuff is about to go down. I know that he's here because he's powerful, right? He's the one that starts the battle. So what did we end up doing with Magneto? Besides giving him all of these new passives, we have removed the amount of things that he can do to simplify him a little bit. Because currently, the Marvel Rivals heroes have a ton of spells. They have so many spells, and so many of them don't need to exist. Overwatch is an amazing example of how you make a game like this. And Overwatch isn't like it's not God amongst men. It is the best hero shooter, regardless of hero balance and management of the game, right? But baseline and the foundations of the game, it's the best one out there. But that doesn't mean you have to follow the footsteps in everything. So it's good that we do try and give more spells to heroes. I think that works, and I think it's good. And I think it's interesting to have more complicated heroes with more abilities and more interesting gameplay loops. If executed really well, right? And that's great. That's great. But currently, there's too much going on with all of the heroes. Magneto is one of the ones where it's more understandable or more reasonable that he has more spells than the regular hero, at least the regular tank hero. And the reason why is basically because he sort of thematically enters the range of this is a difficult character, kind of, because he's magic and mage stuff tends to be more complicated because it's sort of a how do you say, it's an analogy of intellect really often when it comes to fantasy universes. Intellectual characters that aren't physically strong or brutes or whatever tend to dabble around in magic, right? An example of the other end of the scale would be something like Hulk, where it's like, okay, you know exactly what Hulk is gonna do. He's a big buff, strong, like he's a big buff green guy. Yeah, you know what Hulk's gonna do. Come on. He doesn't need to be complicated. You can create a very, very interesting gameplay loop and a very unique one that has a lot of depth, but his kit itself shouldn't be complicated and shouldn't have too much going on. Magneto is in the area where he's allowed to have a little bit more. So that's why I've given him a bit more. Iron Volley, his primary fire. We've changed it so that it implodes and explodes. Iron Ring, his passive. We've made it much more akin to Zarya from Overwatch and made his abilities interact with it. Magno Blade replaces Mag Cannon. Alright, Magno Blade is a payoff to the new abilities that he has to actually manipulate the position of enemy heroes, because that's thematically aligns with what and who Magneto is. Metallic Curtain, the same deal. It manipulates positions and it's more akin to Sigma from Overwatch to give it a bit more of a unique flair, right? Then we have Metal Bulwark and the other Bulwark. I can't remember what it's called. I think it might be Iron Bulwark. We removed one of them because it was not very fun if you're just gonna run around with a bunch of barriers and then have a bad mag cannon to throw, right? So what we did instead is just make it a single spell that just shields allies. It's fine that he can't do it himself, and why is that fine? Because we allow the metallic or the metal curtain to take the role of his self barrier. That's already what it is. We don't need to have an extra spell for it. We can just make sure that the spell itself is a little bit stronger so that he can use it for that fact, right? So that he can use it as what Iron Bulwark used to do, so that we have more space for more interesting spells. Then we have Magnetic Descent, and he can keep that. Doesn't really matter. That's also just thematic, right? There's really no reason he has it. Cool. That is what I had to show you for today. I really hope you enjoyed this. I have made a new kit for each of the Vanguards thus far. And I really want to create videos for the rest of them. So I really hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, do let me know. I'd be very, very willing, or rather, I really want to create the rest of the videos and get them out there. And I hope that you enjoyed. Have a nice day.